Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture offers you a quick tour of the human axial skeleton. Now, the human axial skeleton is made up of three different parts: the skull, the vertebral column, and finally the thoracic cage. So we'll look at all of those parts in a little bit more detail. The human skeleton includes 206 bones for an adult. Rather than cover 206 bones independently, it's convenient to break up the skeleton into the axial and appendicular divisions. This lecture covers the axial division, which includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. The axial skeleton gets its name because it forms the axis, which is really the center of your body, whereas the appendicular skeleton hangs off the axis or the axial skeleton. So in this picture here, we have the axial skeleton is in green and the appendicular skeleton is in yellow. To start, let's take a look at the skull. The human skull has 22 bones, 8 of which are made up of the cranial bones and 14 of which make up the facial bones. Now that's a tall order to ask you to learn all of them and all of their different parts. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a skull of our own, and I'll go over some of the more important bones that will provide a good reference point for comparative anatomy with marine mammals. So here I actually have a handy-dandy take-apart skull, which is pretty awesome because this works a lot like a puzzle. Anatomy students usually use this and they take it apart and then put it back together again, and it gives you a nice three-dimensional view of what's going on with the human skull. So what I'm going to do here is just draw your attention to the basic area of cranial bones versus facial bones to start. So the cranial bones are going to encase the cranium or the brain. So of course that is where your brain is, and that's going to include all of these bones back over here. So this area right here is really the cranium or the cranial bones. And then of course the rest of them are going to be some of the smaller bones, and you can see that there are different colors along here, the smaller bones that make up the face. So the facial bones are going to be anywhere from basically right around here and then going inside the eye, inside the nose, and then to the other side. So those are going to be the facial bones. What I want to do is give you a closer look at some of the facial bones and their features. So let's come over here and we'll take a look. Okay, so right here what I have is basically the skull on its side, and that's going to bring us to one of the most important bones here in the face, which is the mandible. So where my finger is tracing along the jaw is all made up of one bone known as the mandible. And of course you can find it on your face by simply tracing along your jawline or your chin, and that represents the mandible. The mandible of course holds the lower row of teeth. What's interesting about the mandible is that it is not actually connected to the rest of the skull. In this model here, it's held here by a little pin, but in real life, this bone is held to the rest of the skull by ligaments and muscles. So because it's not actually sutured onto the skull by bone connecting to bone, this mandible has a lot of mobility, which of course allows us speech and the ability to chew and move our food like so. Now holding the upper teeth are the maxilla. We have two, 1 and 2, and they come together and they form the maxillae. So we have a maxilla, which includes our upper teeth, and then you might notice in here, going in here, this is going to be the area where we have our nose. So our nose basically gives way to these nasal cavities, and it's a little difficult to see here, but you can kind of see there's a lot of bone structure going on in there. And then also we have the orbits, which hold the eyes, and a couple different bones going on there as well. Now in an earlier lecture I mentioned lacrimal bones, so I'll just quickly point that out for reference. This bone right here in orange is the lacrimal bone, and it's involved in the formation of tears. All right, now moving to the underside, what I wanted to show you is what happens with the palate and the nostril. So notice that in humans we have our palate, which again is going to be made up of the maxilla and another set of bones here that I won't name because it's not really important for this topic. But then right above that we have the other side of the nasal cavity, which comes out like so, and you can see that we have two nasal cavities that will eventually come out and become the windpipe. So we have nostrils that lead to the nasal cavities, which eventually become the windpipe or the trachea. Now this is important because in a lot of cetaceans, we see that the nostril is no longer on the front of the face, that is actually moved from here back to the top of the head considerably. So that's going to alter the skull shape dramatically, that movement. And we'll talk about that in another lecture. For now, let's go ahead and turn back and take a look at some of the other features of the axial skeleton. Okay, before we do that, I do quickly want to mention something that's going to become a little important later on, which is that some bones, especially bones of the skull, actually have air spaces, and these are called sinuses. It's not evident when you take a look at a skull, but it is noticeable when you take a skull bone and you start slicing it in half and opening it up. And you'll actually see that there's air pockets in there. We actually have a big air pocket right here. It's called our frontal sinus, and we have some right here as well. They're air pockets that we know and don't love so much when they get infected, which of course are called sinus infections. These are going to be air spaces that may pose some difficulties for diving marine mammals. Okay, the next section to look at is actually the human vertebral column. And the human vertebral column is just going to be the collection of vertebrae that basically make a nice long column. Now, the vertebrae are actually divided up into 5 different regions. We have the cervical vertebrae, we have the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar, the sacral, and the coccyx vertebrae. So those are in order: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccyx vertebra. Okay, each one of those is going to have its own special use, which we'll explore in a different lecture. But for now, I just want to cover the curvature because it's a little bit interesting. Adult humans have special curvature in their spinal cord. Essentially, what we have is we have a curve that goes one way and then flips and goes another way and then goes one way and then another way respectively. So again, when you're taking a look at it, it looks like almost like a snake, and you can see that here. Now that's really interesting because very few mammals actually exhibit that type of alternating curvature. And for us, that reflects the fact that we are trying to stand up and support our weight. So because we are bipedal organisms and we need to support our weight upright, and our spinal column actually helps us do that, we actually have curvature that kind of builds on itself. So it's not going to be necessarily straight up and down, and it's not all one curvature as we see with a lot of quadrupeds or mammals that are on 4 limbs. And also interesting, this is the curvature that's seen in adults, but it's not seen in newborns or in fetuses. In those small children or unborn children, the curvature is usually just like this. And anybody who's ever held a newborn baby knows this, because when you hold the baby from the bottom, the baby kind of folds over like this, where the head drops down a little bit. So this is curvature that we develop as we start to stand up and walk around. It's just kind of interesting. All right, and finally we get to our last feature, which is the thoracic cage. The thoracic cage is going to include the 12 sets of ribs that articulate with the thoracic vertebrae. You may have noticed in an earlier slide that there were 12 thoracic vertebrae, and there are 12 ribs. So each thoracic vertebrae supports 1 pair of ribs. Now most of those ribs come back around to the front and connect through costal cartilage to the front here, which is also included in that thoracic cage. That produces an enclosed cage that is necessary to protect the viscera, which includes the heart, the lungs, and even some of the digestive organs. So the reason that our thoracic cage is considered to be closed is because we make a complete cage from the back of our spinal column all the way down up to the front, where they attach to the sternum, which is that center region right in here. So this is considered to be the sternum. And you can see that clearly in the picture with the connection. Not all mammals have a closed rib cage. Many do, but some do not, including some marine mammals. And we're going to talk about why they might have an open rib cage or an unconnected rib cage later. So just to review the parts of the thoracic cage, we have the sternum, and the sternum is going to be right here in the front. You can actually tap your sternum, it's called your breastplate. And then we have a set of ribs that come around and articulate. Now notice that most of the ribs are connected by a white segment. That's actually not bone, that's cartilage, and they're called the costal cartilages. And cartilage is more flexible than bone. And that's really important when we breathe, because when we breathe, our rib cage needs to be able to move a little bit. So what I want you to do at home is to actually take a couple deep breaths and go ahead and put your hands on your rib cage when you do that. And you should notice that your rib cage expands and contracts, expands and contracts. It's a good breathing exercise. But that expansion and contraction is made possible by these costal cartilage connections, which allows some mobility in there. So we are allowed to expand and contract. But notice you can't completely contract your rib cage. In other words, we couldn't flatten it if we wanted to. And that's because there's not extreme flexibility with that costal cartilage. So there is still some rigidity in there. But again, it's a cost and benefit analysis where we say it's more important to have a closed rib cage to protect our vital organs, heart, lungs, than it is to really be able to expand greatly and contract greatly. That cost-benefit analysis may not hold up for some of the marine mammals, as we're going to see later on. And finally, you might notice that some of the ribs are not connected at all. And these are actually special ribs called floating ribs. So these are the ones down at the bottom of the thoracic vertebrae that are not connected to any part of the sternum. All right, with that, I'll see you next time.